Thanks so much for joining for today's event. This is one of the collaborative events between The Philosopher and Boston Review. For those who've joined these events before, you probably know by now that The Philosopher is a UK-based public philosophy journal. But for those of you, especially those in the UK, who may not have heard so much about Boston Review is an independent, non-profit public space for the discussion of ideas and culture. They publish new online essays several times a week in areas like the arts, law, gender and sexuality, race, philosophy, and science, all of it 100% free to read. They also publish 4 print issues a year, of which the latest, The Politics of Pleasure, Debating the Good Life, has just come out within the last month, featuring a lead essay by the British philosopher Kate Soper, in which she proposes the possibility that a post-growth economy need not be a recipe for austere misery. So turning to today's event, why does the state care about your gender? Leading gender theorists Paisley Currah and Robin Dembroff will consider the work that sex classifications do in structuring politics and policy, asking what the regulation of transgender identity tells us about society's approach to sex and gender writ large. So to give a brief introduction to our speakers, Paisley Currah is a professor of political science and women's and gender studies at Brooklyn College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. His newest book, Sex Is As Sex Does, Governing Transgender Identity, was published this year by New York University Press and will be the major topic of the discussion to follow. Robin Dembroff, who has kindly agreed to be Paisley's interlocutor for the event today, is assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy at Yale. Robin's first book, Real Men on Top, How Patriarchy Weaponizes Gender, will be published next year by Oxford University Press. More details about both Paisley and Robin, including their websites, Twitter accounts, etc., can be found in the box below this video. So all that being said, I now welcome Paisley and Robin for what promises to be a really fascinating discussion.
So thanks for being in conversation with me today, Paisley. It was a pleasure to read your book, and I'm so excited that we're able to chat for a bit about it. So the first question I wanted to ask you is, so when I was reading the book, I was really struck by, and I loved the way that you wove not just story in general, but also first-person narrative and your own story into the creation of the book. And so I wanted to just ask you, as a piece of kind of personal intellectual history of the book, how did you come into writing this book? How does it relate to things that you wrote about earlier in career? And how does your personal experience as a transgender person inform your either like choosing to write on this topic or the content of the book itself?
Finally, I remember to unmute myself. Yeah, well, thanks. I'm so delighted to be here with you, Robin, talking about this. But I have to tell you, when Anthony first invited me to do this, I just did not respond to his email because I find philosophers so intimidating. Later, I responded, it's like, I'm so sorry, I forgot, I didn't see your email. But you guys are smart and you use words like ontology, and I get all nervous. So, anyways, I did gear myself up to do this, but I'm trained as a political scientist, and hopefully there won't be too many big words thrown at me, but I will try. Anyways, in terms of my own intellectual journey, I had been doing a lot of work on, trans advocacy. I was an academic, but I was also doing a lot of advocacy work. It was before there was a kind of professionalized trans movement. So it was just kind of people who had day jobs and were doing a lot of advocacy. And so I was very much within this kind of nice traditional rights-based framework. Let's pass a non-discrimination law. Let's get these policies in place. Let's get sex reclassification policies in place. And that work, as it continued, it really has informed my thinking and all the I have, maybe have some kind of sense of myself as oh, I have a PhD. I went to Cornell at the height of the post-structuralist revolution. I do critical stuff. I'm so smart. But in fact, in doing advocacy, I kind of realized there's a certain kind of technical bureaucratic rationality that I didn't really understand until I was meeting with policymakers who were talking about sex reclassification. So that kind of, you can read, every year Foucault's lectures all you want, but until you're actually talking with officials from the Department of Mental Health and Hygiene, did I not really understand what was really going on. So, but at a certain point in in my work, I kind of took a step back from advocacy. First of all, because there were people with paid jobs and I did not need to burn a hole in my credit card bill anymore, flying around and doing things like that. And second of all, I just kind of I thought, I have a PhD, I have an academic job. I could just sit back and actually be a scholar for a few years. Let's just see how that goes. And I was really interested in this question of sex classification, like why I was interested in thinking about like, why is it so easy for me to change my driver's license, but it would be difficult for me to be, classified as M for the purposes of marriage? Or why is it so hard to change my birth certificate in Canada? This is in the early 2000s. So I was really interested in this problem of like contradictions. Like, how is it possible that one person could be two different things? And I was stuck on that for quite a while because I was trying to like solve the contradiction. I was trying to think, oh, there's a way, there's some global governing rationality will explain the contradiction. And then pretty soon I realized like that was the wrong approach.
I love that you're trying to solve the contradictions. It's a very philosophical move of you, like, must make it logically okay. Totally. And I like that you brought up the reclassification point, because I wanted to ask something about that, especially because I assume that many people who are tuning in haven't had a chance to read the full book. So one of the things that Paisley's book does that's so great for those of you tuning in is that it focuses on uncovering the logics of state sex classification by emphasizing reclassification policies. And you kind of focus on these kinds of edge cases as a way to draw out those logics. So for those of you that haven't had a chance to read it yet, Paisley, I want to give you a chance to talk more about this. So why focus on reclassification as a way to reveal the broader function of classification?
Yeah, and I came into it like, it would be nice if I had said it the way you did and thought, oh, I'll focus on reclassification, the edge case. But I was like, that's a smart way to say it. But I focused on reclassification because as a trans person, I want to understand like how I would get reclassified. So I kind of came into through this kind of identity politics kind of logic of like, what's happening to transgender people and why is the state sometimes transphobic and sometimes not transphobic. And then as it turned out, it turns out to be a way to understand how like, because sex classification is like baked into the architecture of governance, because sex classification was used, or sex was used to distinguish between men and women and make sure men, for the most part, men got more stuff than women. So transgender people become this kind of accidental byproduct of the use of this distinction to treat men and women differently. And I decided to use, it would be better if I had used the word gender, because even my emails and stuff get blocked because I have sex too much in my title, So, but I decided to use the word sex because I just basically take this kind of like, I don't know what sex is. I'm not really engaging directly in that debate. So for the purposes of the book, as this kind of methodological move, I'm just defining sex as the effect of government decision. So sex is what the state says it is. I don't think that's true necessarily, but from my kind of methodological way to think through these problems, that's what I understood sex to be. And then of course, gender is so much else. Gender probably powers these decisions. It powers our narratives, our identities. So much else is going on, social arrangements, but I just use this word sex. But I don't want to give the impression that I think I'm talking about biological sex. I'm talking about the effect of a state decision. But what it did make me understand is like there was so much important work in women and gender studies and feminist studies talking about gender as a distributive mechanism, and there was so much trans stuff focused very specifically on sex reclassification policies, and it became clear to me that they could be read together. So trans people were not it wasn't like officials were saying, oh, how can we screw over trans people? But it was more like, oh, if trans people change their sex classification, what does that do to the larger edifice of making distinctions between men and women?
Right. So would you say that the thing that we see when we focus on reclassification is, would you say that we see a place where what affects trans people is put into contrast with what's affecting the broader population more generally? Or kind of trying to get a sense for what is it that you think that we see that we miss if we focus only on classification?
Right. I think what we see is, I think it just like reveals how, even because we think, okay, cisgender women are women and cisgender men are men, and it's so easy for the government to distinguish them. I think when we look at the question of sex classification, we see how like sex works differently in different state projects. So for example, for me, it was like, why do different agencies have different rules? And it's a very messy thing. Sometimes they have different rules because they were informed differently by medical communities. Sometimes they like a town or a city or will have different rules because somebody's sister was a trans woman, like who was a policymaker. Like it can be very messy, but in some sense, I did see some patterns. And so, for example, institutions, state agencies that focus on like tracking populations over space. So like giving people driver's licenses that have an M or an F on it. DMVs were in the United States were always the earliest to make it possible for people to change their sex classification, and also the earliest to drop onerous barriers like surgery. So I was like, and I was like, from a trans rights perspective, like, oh, that's great. They're like not transphobic. And then I compared those decisions to like, there was a lot of these appellate decisions on trans people in marriages where people who had changed all their identity documents, in the early part of the century before same-sex marriage was legalized in the United States, were still found to have the sex assigned to them at birth for the purposes of marriage. And this is in cases where divorce and custody disputes and so on. It's like, so I realized like it depends on what sex was doing in these particular regimes that change the definition. And I think that logic should take us back into thinking about how gender itself, even when we're talking about purportedly cisgender people, it operates differently in different government agencies and institutions.
Yeah, and I really love that you pull that out in the book too. That I think sometimes we can have this homogenous view of the state, and you really pull out that there are so many different regulatory agencies that often have different interests or different purposes for sex classification, such that a transgender person can have one sex marked on their birth certificate and another one on their driver's license, and kind of have to move between these different regulatory agencies in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, I got stuck. Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I got stuck on that for a while because I was thinking, again, I was trying to solve this contradiction because I was still stuck in the idea like there was just M and F and now X, and it should be based on gender identity or something. And then it took me a while to realize like there are many different definitions of sex, and there are many different definitions. There are many different state actors, and that they're both kind of plural forces, and they're producing different effects. But it took me a while to figure that out.
Yeah, you're saying so many things that touch on so many of the questions that I wanted to ask. So I'm scrolling through my list, like which ones I want to ask. So I think maybe I'll touch on the last thing you said about the like having an X on the birth certificate or adding additional classifications to the taxonomies. One of the things that I've noticed recently is that there's been a large push, particularly from people on the left, to just expand the taxonomies of sex classification. So add agender, add non-binary, add X, etc. And I take it from your book, and I'm very sympathetic with this line, that you think that kind of political aim doesn't go far enough, or maybe it just goes in the wrong direction altogether. So I'm wondering if you can say more about how you think about these kinds of aims, and do you think that there's any legitimate role for state sex classification?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, one of the things that I did, because I was trained as a political theorist, and one of the things I did in this book was just step back from temporarily bracket any kind of like larger questions about justice and normative claims. So just trying to figure out like what was happening. But I definitely understand and I agree with, and as someone who has changed every possible identity document I can, like I think it's vitally important for trans people to be able to get whatever M, F, or X, or whatever marker we want in an identity document. So I definitely think that's important. But what I want us to be able to do too is from kind of a larger perspective, is understand what is happening when we're pursuing solely a kind of politics of recognition, because that politics of recognition also goes along with passing non-discrimination laws and getting good trans inclusive policies. And I'm for all of that. I'm for all non-discrimination laws and all trans inclusive policies, but it doesn't really get at the larger structures that affect trans people's lives in terms of like their health, their longevity, the livability of trans lives. So so the three policy changes that would help the most transgender people the most are not trans specific. They are having in the United States, having a national publicly funded healthcare plan and make it different than the one in England so that it's funded enough to make sure people get the services they need. Prison abolition, and doing as much as we can to end income inequality. Because passing a non-discrimination law isn't enough, because there's all these stats that float around, and there's a study that came out recently talking about the vulnerability to early death that trans people face, especially trans women of color. And it's not like that vulnerability to early death is only happening in the red states in the United States. It's a
Right.
blue state problem as well. And so my goal is to get people to obviously continue to pass these good trans inclusive policies, but also to step back and see how sex is still implicated in structural oppression.
Yeah, I love that, especially the structural point, because I mean, one of the things you say in your book is that you don't want to focus on changes in these laws through a lens of sort of like an intentional transphobia, but you're instead focused on things as the regulation of populations and a kind of structural. I mean, you don't use this language in the book, at least as I saw, but I thought of it as almost like a structural transphobia in the same way that we talk about structural racism. And I'm curious, would you agree with that characterization?
Yeah, that's an interesting way to think about it. I just as an aside, the press has had me do all these kind of interviews with like radio stations and so on. I pick up the phone and someone says, "I don't care who you sleep with," and I'm like, that's good. Anyways, it's so fun to have a discussion with someone who read the book and understand it. It says smarter things than I even thought about in the book. So anyways, thank you so much for reading the book so well. But so what I want to do is kind of move away. This is how I've been thinking about it, move away from understanding a policy as transphobic or not. So for example, in New York, we think, oh, we have this great birth certificate policy. And I'll put a link in the chat at some point, because the New York Review of Books did an excerpt of my book that talks about one case that illustrates a lot of the arguments. But like in New York City, we have this great birth certificate policies. Like anybody can who was born here in the city can change their birth certificate to M, F, or X. There's not too much paperwork. There's no medical affidavits. It's really great. And so that seems like it's not transphobic. And in some sense, of course, it's not transphobic. On the other hand, babies that are born in New York City still get an M or an F. Like everybody else is part of this kind of sex classification system. And it becomes really clear that the mayor and the city council of New York were reaching out to this transgender community as a political constituency to give them what they wanted. But it doesn't necessarily, end all sex classification, or even like, for example, with the DMV policies, it's in the state interest for us to be recognized, so it doesn't help the police officer pulling me over if I hand over a driver's license that says F on it. So the policy is not transphobic, but it's almost accidentally not transphobic. So, and we can get later in the discussion to like the new wave of actually existing intense transphobia. That is a different thing. But so I wanted people to kind of understand more like what sex was doing as a technology of government, instead of just thinking of it like, oh, those bureaucrats are mean or not nice to transgender people, or they're good to transgender people.
Right. And one of the things I was struck by in your book when you were talking about that, when you say like M or F is secured to infants, even in New York, where there are these very liberal policies. And one of the claims you make that I found really striking is you said that, quote, securing M or F to someone is a constitutively violent process. And I think that language of it being inherently violent will be surprising to many people. So I wanted to just give you an opportunity to say more about why do you see this bureaucratic process as a constitutively violent one?
Yeah, I mean, and from that, I take, one of the founders of Transgender Studies is Susan Stryker, and her really important piece from like the early 90s. What's it called? Frankenstein. I forget what it's called. It's got Frankenstein.
Oh, yeah. It's got French in it.
Yeah, it's a lot going on. It's easily found though. Susan Stryker and Frankenstein. And she talks about this moment as a moment of constituent violence, because and that's why the trans community says the assigned sex at birth. We tend not to say the birth sex. So sometimes there's a short form, sometimes you use quicker language, because we want to talk about how like the category produces the label produces the kind of person, and that kind of person that gets produced by that label is going to have access to different kinds of opportunities and resources. And one of the things that really so that is like, central to like trans studies and central to my work. And I see that kind of as like this kind of, constitutive violence, like Derrida moment. And then what made it all kind of fall into place for me is realizing like I had to kind of add Foucault to that too, and see the state as like complicated, plural, all over the place, not always based in constitutions, but it could be accretions of practices and norms and unwritten rules. So with putting those two things together, like it's this moment of labeling of constitutive violence and understanding that it's happening differently in all these different power centers. So the state, moving away from the idea of the state as this kind of unitary, hierarchical, rational thing, instead of seeing it as all these different kind of like assemblages of norms and rules operating sometimes at different purposes.
And do you see that kind of multiplicity as creating I mean, maybe it's the answer is both, but on the one hand, I could see someone saying, well, all the ability to kind of move between different jurisdictions in a way gives more space for movement. It gives more space for people to kind of find ways to be able to be reclassified. Now, on the other hand, someone might say, well, that creates even more of a problem for trans people because now they have this split classification across jurisdictions and it actually makes things harder for them. Do you have a view about what you kind of think the effect of this kind of kaleidoscopic landscape is on trans people or people who are generally non-conforming?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, one would think the fact that there's so much contradictions, one could say, and so there's a contradiction in how I'm classified, and that's not my fault. And I always go back to this kind of Stuart Hall quote where he's talking about Thatcher's England. And he says, it's the academics' idea that if they just point out the contradictions, the whole edifice will just come crumbling down. And in fact, like, if there's if you're like arrested by a sheriff in one town and you're put in what you think is the wrong prison, you say, but I have this birth certificate, like they don't care. Like, so I think it doesn't, because it's not just an existence of a contradiction or a difference, but it's also always about like literally old fashioned non-Foucauldian state power of locking you up or something. Sometimes I don't focus so much on the potential for resistance. On the other hand, but in talking about the book, I've got a couple of comments like that, and it is something kind of more interesting to think about in terms of people kind of being able to remake themselves.
Yeah. So I want to circle back now actually to, there was one part I was like, oh, I could go to this question, but I'll circle back to it. So there's a question about, you said at one point, something to the effect of that you're not talking about biological sex, or you're not talking about kind of like the debates that exist about whether there is, and if so, what it is, some sort of biological basis for sex classification. And so I wanted to invite you to say more about that too, because on the one hand, someone could look at your book and just say, well, this is just talking about a completely different thing than all the scholarship that's talking about biological sex classification, because the thing you're talking about, and you're very explicit about this, is something that is created by sort of institutional pronouncement. So you say that sex classifications are produced through the very decision that results in the classification. You kind of speak it, the state speaks it into existence, so to speak. And so I'm wondering, do you think that this is a completely different conversation than ones about biological sex, or do you think there's some sort of interrelation or even interdependence between these two conversations?
Well, I think discourses around biological sex are super important, but I think one of the things we can see from the work by people like, Katrina Karkazis and Rebecca Jordan-Young and folks like that is like, there, as we know, there's no biological sex answer when it comes to thinking about gender identity, and one could produce any number of different decisions about which particular criteria of the body we might decide to make stand for sex. So I think the discourse around biological sex, like what some people think are important, like I think those matter, but it's such a messy concept itself that it's not going to really provide the answer that a politics would. I mean, of course, people want to go to nature. My friends who are legal advocates, they want to go to science and nature, and I totally agree with that as a strategy in the courts. I think it's great, but I think in terms of a larger political frame, it can't really provide an answer.
So I'm curious, I want to follow up on what you just said, because my next question was going to be something about what's the sort of ideology of biological sex that you see functioning in these state contexts? Like, do you find lawmakers to be kind of aware of this constitutive pronouncement effect of sex classification, or do they take themselves to be tracking some sort of binary biological reality? And then my next question is, regardless of what the answer to that is, why, if it's the case that sex classification isn't really tracking some biological reality because there is no binary reality to be had, or there is no sort of like one-to-one correlation with biological features and how people either are seen by others or prefer to be seen by others or something like that. Why is it that you think that appealing to nature or science is a good strategy in the courts?
Well, I'll speak to the last question first. I think it's a good strategy in the courts because we've seen with some of these kind of anti-trans legislation that's happened in some of the Republican states, friends of mine who kind of litigate those cases, they're Trump appointed judges. They're getting Trump appointed judges and they're still winning. And it's just like, it seems like they're really going against the odds, but the science is not so much they get all the 22 major medical associations, all these kind of people, these institutions weighing in, and then they put like a kid in front of a judge, and focusing on moving the discussion to the harm a policy is going to cause a young person, and moving it away from abstract definitions of like who is right, Butler or blah blah blah. Abstract definitions of sex and gender is a really good move, because the right wing wants us to be debating gender ideology, and we need not. First of all, they're not doing it in good faith, but second of all, that's not a debate we're going to win in terms of thinking about public opinion. So if we can talk about the effects of policies on actual people and say, well, I don't know, who knows what your definition of sex and gender is, but here's this kid, they have, strongly felt themselves to be a girl since they were 3, and you want to make this kid change their name to John and wear pants and use the boys' bathroom, and what's that going to do to this kid? So I do agree, like recourse to those arguments can be very effective, but I don't think that actually, maybe you could rephrase the first part of your question, because I sort of forgot that.
The first part was just about whether you've found that lawmakers really buy into this kind of myth of there being a binary structure to human biological constitution, or whether you think that it's more, like you said, in bad faith, where they're kind of aware that they're appealing to something that doesn't exist, but they're doing it more out of a political maneuver.
Yeah, it's so interesting, because I hadn't really thought of like that way to ask the question, but I think what's happening now is sort of in bad faith, right? With the Republican legislatures, saying, like in Utah, they passed a bill saying trans girls can't play on girls' teams, etc. And the governor of Utah, who was a Republican, vetoed the bill, and the legislature overrode the bill, so it passed. But basically, there are 75,000 students in Utah who play high school sports. There was one trans girl playing high school sports, and there had been no complaints about her. So they're passing this bill, just for political purposes. We see the same thing in Texas, where 250 people died in Texas when the electrical grid failed. The legislative priority of the state of Texas, of the governor of Texas, is to make sure trans kids can't play sports. So I do think there's like some kind of bad faith going on now. For sure. But looking at like legislative stuff, talking about just sex classification per se from years ago, I think they're just not interrogating the assumptions, and they're just like, well, I have this the longest quote in the book, I just could not stop quoting it, was a legislative hearing from Tennessee, where these people were saying like, but you can't just change your sex, and the advocates were saying, well, you can change your name, you can add adoptive parents, you can really actually change a lot. They're like, but you can't change your sex, it's a historical record. So I think they weren't going to be swayed for political reasons, but I think I think it was kind of an it's kind of I hate to say good faith in that context, but I think they were doing something different that's happening now, which is really kind of a bad faith weaponizing of trans issues that will result in harming people, and they know better. They know better.
Right. And even I really liked that exchange in the book between those different policymakers, and one of the things that struck me was the slide that exists between, like you said, his kind of descriptive historical claim and a prescriptive claim, because even while they're claiming that it's a purely descriptive marker, they also expect it to have all sorts of prescriptive implications for how someone can live and move through the world, which I think you draw out by talking about what sex does, right? Like what is it? I know. What's the
but it's
function?
so good. It's fun talking to you, because you say all these smart things about the book I wish I had thought of myself, but that's what happens when you talk to a philosopher. But thank you.
That's very generous of you. So one of the things, going back to the current legal political moment, one of the claims that you make in the book, which I also found really striking, was that part of the reason why trans people have been able to more and more access reclassification is sort of because sex has been doing less at the state level. It's become less important as a state marker, and that's kind of opened up space for reclassification to become less important in some ways to a lot of these bodies. But it also seems like in the current political moment, the far right is trying to reassert in some ways the importance of sex classification and what it does. So I'm wondering if you can talk about that and how you see sort of what sex does as a dynamic and an adaptive thing within the state, and how that's appearing in our current moment.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So yeah, and looking at the policies, one of the things that it's sort of unrecognized, goes largely unrecognized in the way the trans rights movement, at least in the United States, narrates itself. It's narrated as like an identity politics movement. Here's a group we're discriminated against, we are fighting back, we are making advocacy, blah, 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 we're winning. But one of the things, and partly because trans stuff is sort of hip, and women and gender studies is sort of slightly unhip, especially second wave feminism, or especially the liberal feminism variety. There's not as much calling back to the liberal feminism that caused these barriers to be erased. So the state's ability to distinguish between men and women was like largely eroded over the course of the 20th century. There's just a few areas now, selective service, maybe a couple of others. And so as those barriers go down, and the biggest one being the ban on same-sex marriage in 2015, the policymakers get much more chilled out about letting people change their sex reclassification. Because we saw that in New York a lot around birth certificates, because they were worried that like a cisgender lesbian would marry another cisgender lesbian, and the cisgender lesbian would say, well, I'm a trans man and I can get married. And they were worried that it would be a way, the way around the kind of the marriage ban. So I think there's really much more of a kind of unacknowledged debt to just old-fashioned kind of liberal feminism that gets acknowledged. But now it's like, I would like to have a discussion with this because I haven't figured out, but now in this weird moment where like the Republicans are trying to kind of, re-prosecute the gender wars. And I used to say, but it's not like they're going to come out and say women have to wear skirts to work or women shouldn't go to work. But actually, I think I might stop saying that, because they might start saying, maybe they are saying that, but they're using trans in a way to kind of re-prosecute, like, what is it to be a woman? What is it to be a man? Who's a proper woman? Who's a proper man? And so they can focus on the trans, but it's also obviously has this larger discursive effect on like masculinity and femininity and who belongs and who doesn't. So I think that's a way to get back into the gender wars. But I mean, that's probably what I would have said a year ago. And now I think they're just going directly at women too, with Dobbs and, with some of the stuff in these states where they're saying kids have to like wear clothes that are associated with a gender assigned at birth. Like that's not just affecting trans kids. In Utah, there was a girl who won something, and the parents of the other competitors said, oh, maybe she's trans, let's investigate her. Like the kid was not trans, but this kid had every school record going back to kindergarten, like examined, right? And so what, I have a 13-year-old kid. What 13-year-old kid would play a sport if they thought that like a committee of state experts were going to examine their school records to see what everything about their body and their gender? So has a larger effect on has a huge effect on cisgender people as well.
Yeah, and I want to ask, I know we're out of time, so to switch to the broader audience, I want to ask one more question, because I think it's a really important piece of your book, is drawing together the transgender rights movement and the feminist movement more broadly. And in philosophy, I think that this is particularly important because a lot of the anti-trans activists who call themselves gender critical feminists come out of philosophy, and they're using a lot of philosophical ideas coming out of like Janice Raymond and so on to try to prop up this opposition as if the rights of trans people and the rights of women are at odds with each other. And one of the things I took from your book is that you think that when we pay attention to the way that sex classification works and how it functions, we see that there's common ground between these two movements, and actually they have similar, there's a lot of space for solidarity between those movements. So I just want to invite you to say more about how you think your book kind of opens up or illuminates these kinds of overlapping spaces.
Yeah, for sure. Because I think that's like an area that hasn't been acknowledged as much, like the effect of the women's movement on the ability of trans people to kind of negotiate and move our way through the world and change policies. And for like just contingent historical reasons in the United States, it was lesbian, gay, bisexual, and then transgender. Like transgender just became part of the queer movement, which I understand like kind of sociologically and even sort of politically. But it was always about gender. Like we were talking about when we were starting to write this legislation 20 years ago, it was like talking about gender identity and expression and gender norms and case law that stereotypes women as having to wear certain kinds of clothes. And these kinds of issues were like clearly related. It just that it became kind of palatable to narrate trans as part of LGBT and queer, which I totally get, but I think we've really lost something. We've lost something with that. So I just find it like, and I guess I definitely live in a kind of feminist trans bubble, but I just find it like it just makes me speechless to see how like trans can be seen as opposed to like gender equality in some contexts. So
right. Thank you. So I don't know, Anthony, are you there? You want to jump back in and moderate questions?
I'm here, yes, very happy to do that. And thank you both so much for that really well-structured and fluid, very interesting conversation. So there are some questions that have already popped in. So I guess I'll just start from the top. And I think what I'll do is obviously both Paisley and Robin are likely to have opinions on all the questions. I'll initially put it to Paisley, and then if Robin wants to pick up on anything, they're welcome to do so, and we'll just go through it that way. Obviously, if you wanted to pose a question more to Robin and Paisley, just put that in the questions. But for now, it seems like they're open to everyone. So the first one is from Joanna, and Joanna asks, in a review of Sexes as Sex Does, I saw reference to the intriguing phrase, quote, gender chaos. What is this? And isn't chaos likely to create the kinds of reactionary responses that we are currently seeing in brackets? People don't seem to like chaos much. Close brackets, thanks.
I know people don't like chaos much. Like I have a 13-year-old, and they had to do a report on gender stuff for their school, and they had to interview an expert, and I didn't make the short list of experts. And that's because they're on TikTok, and I don't know, there's so much I don't know about gender. There's so many terms I don't know. There's so many names, there's so many identities, there's so many flags. I just learned today that there's a ring for some groups. So we might see yourself in this flowering of kind of gender diversity and gender pluralism, and I think that's possibly right in terms of like many people don't like that chaos. From my perspective, this is more towards the end of the book, I talk about that gender chaos in terms of gender pluralism, and I make the analogy with disestablishment. In the United States, gender's disestablished, or religion's disestablished, supposedly, maybe not, but gender could be disestablished, and we could get the standard of regulating gender. And I do agree with that. But the one, from my perspective, more from a critical perspective, the one nervousness I have about gender pluralism and discourses of gender pluralism is that the lack of symmetry between men and women, or kind of an asymmetrical power relations between men and women, that drops out of the picture. And certainly in terms of formal legal equality, there's no asymmetrical power relations. But in terms of like who gets paid what and things like violence and things like that, there's certainly still a lot of asymmetry. And so from my perspective, I get nervous around just only celebrating gender pluralism without finding ways to keep analyses of misogyny right in there.
Thank you. Robin, was there anything you wanted to pick up on in that question?
I just wanted to add something really small, which is I think a lot of the gender chaos that Paisley reveals in his book is not chaos that trans people have created or that feminists have created. It's chaos that it's being revealed. It already exists within the state structures. And I think what's happening is that that chaos that already is there gets covered over with this ideology of biological essentialism. So it's not like it's being created, it's just being illuminated. And same with all the different varieties of gender expression and so on. Now they're getting names and they're on TikTok, but they weren't not there before. They're just being highlighted.
Thank you. That's great. So the next question picks up on something Paisley said earlier in the talk. So it says, please, can you say something more about how the policy suggestions you mentioned, e.g. prison abolition and reduced income inequality, would be especially useful to trans people as opposed to policies that appear more trans specific? Thanks for this great talk.
Sure. So basically it kind of refers to what I said a while ago, like in progressive jurisdictions that have non-discrimination laws and good identity document policies, we still see people who are over incarcerated, who are not living as long as their cisgender peers and their white peers. We still see all these kind of all these kinds of problems. And in the one chapter of the book, which is not exactly about sex classification, it's about prison policy and it's about the concept of transgender. We see we see transgender rights advocates saying, oh, if we just pass these non-discrimination laws, then trans people won't have to do survival sex and other things that are criminalized and won't end up in jail. And that argument, it's okay. It maybe works rhetorically, but it presupposes that jail is good, that it's fine to put people in jail for sex work or using drugs or things like that. And it doesn't acknowledge the role of prisons and the carceral complex in the role of the economy. So it's just more of a kind of minor, kind of neoliberal rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic sort of approach, instead of understanding like people are incarcerated because it's an economic policy in the United States, not because of transphobia per se. So I just think I'm for all these little laws or politics of recognition. I'm for them, but I just think they're not going to solve the problems. Sadly, we have a lot bigger problems to face.
Thanks, Paisley. Robin, was there anything you wanted to pick up on that question?
No, I think Paisley said it all. I agree with everything he said.
Great. So the next question asks about the differences between the state's role in control versus care in terms of the work of sex re/classification. And then great conversation. Look forward to reading the book. So it's this idea of control versus care, and as far as I can tell, you focus mainly on control. So maybe they're looking especially to thinking about the role of the state in terms of care in relation to sex classification.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. Like in terms of care, I would think about it like in New York City, for example, the Department of Homeless Services, which was much quicker to change their policy to make where they put people based on gender identity, versus the Department of Corrections, which has been changing their policy all the time, or the State Department of Corrections. Departments of Corrections are much more likely to house people according to like the status of their genitals. Policies are changing slowly, but the whole point of prisons is to produce pain, is to distribute pain. So like ensuring that people feel safe and comfortable in a carceral complex is not the role of prisons. But the so-called care segments of the public sector are supposed to be about a bit more about those kinds of things. So, but it really depends on resources too. So in New York City, for example, drug treatment centers that involve beds and placements were terrible for transgender people, because they felt like they couldn't provide care for their cisgender clients if transgender people were provided with beds. So sometimes it gets to be really, at one point Foucault says, like, when he's talking about governmentality, it's so important. Then he says it's too boring to study. I mean, it's kind of for his grad students to do, but it often depends on like these little kind of minute factors, like the architecture, the funding, the beds, that where transgender people are cared for or not.
Thank you, Robin. Anything on that? Oh, I think Robin's disappeared. So we'll just move on to the next question. So this is from an anonymous attendee who asks, should sex classification be abolished or reformed? If you agree with the latter, reformed to do what exactly?
Yeah, I think we could take anonymous and Florence together, because I think they might be somewhat similar. So
okay, cool. Yeah.
I think sex classification now, it doesn't really, except for selective service in the United States, it doesn't really serve any purposes. It's on our birth certificates, for example, for kind of cultural reasons. So Mayor de Blasio in New York City was not going to take birth certificates or sex off birth certificates, because it would just cause too much of a furor amongst most of the population. Because even as we're talking about disestablishing sex and making it easier for people to change their sex classification, we're also, at the height of like gender reveal parties. So like culturally, it still kind of matters. And so insofar as the government or state agencies kind of deliver what people are culturally expecting, it's going to be a long battle. But my point, so I think administrative sex classification is getting abolished in progressive jurisdictions and not getting abolished or in red jurisdictions because of this kind of cultural wars around gender. But I think the battle over structural inequalities can take place as we're trying to reform these policies. Like we can do both, and we can try to get the state out of the business of defining sex. But maybe Robin could add to that.
No, I mean, I'm trying to think if I have anything to add. I don't think I have anything to add to that. I mean, I agree with everything that you just said.
Okay, thank you. Just to clarify the question from Florence that Paisley referenced, which he kind of co-answered with the other one, is there a way to make sure that we can still see and analyze structural inequalities while at the same time abolishing administrative sex distinction? So thanks for that question, Florence. There's still a few minutes left, so if you have any other questions, please keep them coming. I see the ones just come in from James Fraser, so it's reasonably long, but I'll give it a go to read it. I was intrigued by the suggestion that it might make more sense strategically from a trans rights perspective to focus on the harm caused by particular policies rather than theoretical arguments about the nature of gender. I'm wondering whether Paisley thinks there is any positive role to be played by more philosophically oriented work on gender, or should these sorts of questions be bracketed entirely? One thought I had is that the case of non-binary gender identities, for example, necessarily leads to more conceptual conflicts, which it might not be possible to bracket. So there's quite a few things in there, Paisley. Please pick out whatever
I think that
like.
certainly philosophical inquiry is important. I'm gonna just punt that over to Robin, because I think people in philosophy, I'm just vaguely aware. I kind of get scared when I see some of the blogs and stuff. I hardly ever look, but I think they have a lot of opinions. So
Yeah.
I'm gonna pass that over to Robin.
Well, yeah, well, one thing I definitely want to draw out here is that I think the philosophical work goes hand in hand with the kind of work that Paisley is doing. Because a lot of what, those of us who are doing the more like theoretical, what is gender, right? We're addressing a lot of the predominant myths about gender that are widely accepted. So gender as natural, gender as binary and discrete and dimorphic and so on, and drawing from work not only from people who are doing feminist biology or feminist science, people like Anne Fausta Sterling and Cordelia Fine, but also drawing from people like Paisley who are kind of uncovering where all that myth falls apart at the social level, at the legal level, and the institutional level is important for doing that theoretical work. So when we ask what is gender and there's this dominant view, well, it's common sense. People say it's common sense that there's men and women and that's it. Then we can go to this important historical and empirical work done by people like Paisley and show that at every possible level of analysis, that kind of view falls apart. And from there, you have open space to try to rebuild a view that can take into account all of that empirical and historical data.
Thanks, Robin. That was great. Paisley, do you want to pick up on what Robin said?
No, I definitely agree. I think we need to kind of come up with all sorts of different kinds of ways of explaining about gender. For me, I was interested in looking at the effects of what it really is, gender norms and arrangements on these decisions about sex. But we can't give up making those larger arguments, for sure. The point about harm, it's very good to someone who's like watches Fox News and is a judge appointed by Trump. It's much better to focus on specific harm a body or a person experiences than getting into debates about gender. But we do hope to change the minds of lots of other kinds of people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I hope that one of the things that people within philosophy will pay attention to is the place where those two conversations come together. So in showing how the uncovered ideology of gender is thoroughly intertwined with the material harms, instead of just talking about the ideas and kind of leaving the empirical observations and the systemic harms that are part of this ideological system to the side.
Absolutely, right.
Thank you. So I think this will probably end up being the last question. It's from Aruvi. And Aruvi's picking up on the title of the review of your book, Paisley and Boston Review, which is Why Does the State Care About Your Gender, which is also the title of today's event. And just, I guess, ultimately asking, does the state care, and why does the state not care enough about the health of, for example, trans and non-binary folks? So I think it was a critical interrogation of the question that we chose to title this event.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good kind of interesting way to think about the play on words in terms of care. Because the state is, the US context, we say the state's supposed to protect for the safety, health, and well-being of the population. But with kind of the HIV rates among some trans communities and the inability of the state agencies to even ask questions about those things, those rates of disease and sickness for a long time, shows that the state doesn't care about certain sorts of populations. I mean, not to say that that's always true across the board. And I liked what I forgot the person's name. I liked what Aruba said about self-care, because like Dean Spade, who's done a lot of work on transgender rights, but there's a new book out now on mutual aid, and some talks kind of brings those things together in terms of the community doing stuff to care for each other. And we see this in like GoFundMe for rent and surgery and self-help, and not self-help, mutual aid sort of thing. So I do think like sometimes the left, the kind of old-fashioned left, kind of poo-poos mutual aid, but I do think the kind of communities coming together to provide for each other is not necessarily letting the state off the hook, but it does provide a kind of a template for how we can care for each other and advocate for change.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Robin, I was wondering, which bits of Paisley's book may you take away and incorporate into the manuscript for Real Men on Top, which you're working with? I mean, where would Paisley's work as a political theorist cross over with your work as a philosopher?
There are many places where I could incorporate things from this book into my book, but I think one that really struck me is the argument for the overlap between what's in transgender people's interests and what's in women's interests at this level of sex classification. And I think the arguments that Paisley makes at the level of the state can also be expanded more broadly to just social sex classification as well.
Okay, fantastic. Paisley, any sort of final words? Any questions you would have liked to have been asked that you weren't, or anything that you kind of want to pick up on about what's maybe happened since the publication of your book that kind of picks up
so
on
my publisher kind of hates when I say this, but the book is really a critique of like left neoliberalism, right? It doesn't, except you should all read it. You should all buy it. So I give my 84 cents a copy, but it doesn't really get to the current political moment. So that's my new project. But the current political moment is a different moment. We're moving from bureaucrats who are not transphobic and not transphobic. We're to the weaponization of gender, where like the state legislature of Oklahoma passes a bill that says we will never issue a non-binary birth certificate. Like it's a different moment we're in. And I think that we need to kind of, even though I think we have to pay attention to like capitalism and neoliberalism, but we have to develop some new skills for the way gender has been weaponized directly against transgender people now.